retro games often tend to be treated like curios that are consigned to an entirely separate era of history. Interesting and not without their charms, but having little active relevance in the present day. And hey, this attitude makes a certain logical sense because the past tense nature of these games is right there in the name. Retro, from the Latin preposition meaning backward, back, behind, as in retroactive or retrospective. But retro games have always been with us, whether we're talking about the individual legacies they leave behind or about how their design impact has resonated across the gulf of time into the latest and greatest modern titles. Retro gaming enjoyed a brief but intense surge in mainstream popularity in the 2000s and early 2010s. In large part, this was due to the rise of internet file sharing and how it gave birth to a thriving scene around ROM-hacking, fan translation, and emulation. And retro gaming has become even more popular still, thanks to the cornucopia of officially emulated classics you could purchase and download via the Xbox Live Arcade, Sony's PS Store, and the Nintendo Wii's eShop. Which is not to be confused with the offer by Nintendo Online for the Switch, which has much lower quality and subscription-only emulation offerings. If you wanted to play Ikaruga on your Xbox 360, Parasite Eve on your PS3, or Metroid Zero Mission on your Wii U, all of this and more was only a few button presses away. But from the mid-2010s onward, basically since the start of the Switch, PS4, Xbox One era, many of these same megacorps have heavily pared back or ruthlessly eliminated their retro offerings. And so classic games return to being treated like obscure antiques by the mainstream gaming press and discourse. Certainly not the type of thing that big publishers invest much finding or development hours into, as evidenced by the incredibly janky official emulation offerings on the PS5 and Switch. But contra this lack of official buy-in, the indie retro emulation and fan translation scenes are going strong as ever, with a vibrant community that is tweaking, retooling, and refurbishing the classics and the kusoge alike so that they can be enjoyed by players today. Despite the ludicrous and exclusionary scalping taking place with older games, hardware, cartridges, and copies these days, in many ways the retro game scene is as strong as it's ever been. Although this is of course incredibly hard to quantify or assign an objective value to. But you only need to look at the incredible cult classic Japan-only games that in recent years have finally been fan-translated to see that the reports of retro gaming's death and irrelevance have been greatly exaggerated. And if you just so happen to be a fan of, say, Shin Megami Tensei, survival horror, the artwork of H.R. Giger, or even just cool old-school dungeon crawlers generally, and there's one forgotten gem that's recently been brought back into the light which just might become your next favorite retro obsession, like it did for me. At the time of this video's release, we've finally been blessed with a first-of-its-kind English-language fan translation of the cult classic roguelike horror RPG Baroque. Developed by Sting Entertainment and first released for the Sega Saturn in 1998 and the Sony PlayStation a year later in 1999. A legend of emulation has risen from its restless slumber in its shallow grave, showing the world how a 25-year-old dungeon crawler brought an incredibly ahead-of-its-time sophistication to its mechanics and an absolutely avant-garde approach to video game narrative and aesthetics that is worth experiencing, even if you're the sort of player who'd usually never consider booting up an actual old-school haunted PS1 game. Baroque is the true-born heir and successor to the template first laid down in 1989 by Sweet Home. It is, in every regard, an evolutionary outgrowth of the fusion of adventure, RPG, and teeth-grinding survival mechanics that first gave rise to the golden age of survival horror. You also could easily argue that it's a much better game to play than titles like Silent Hill or Clock Tower, though Baroque does not come anywhere close to the notoriety of its much more well-known contemporaries. Now, while the original Baroque for the Sega Saturn and PS1 never saw the light of day outside of the Land of the Rising Sun, it's important to point out that North America and Europe did receive the PS2 and Wii remakes that came westward a decade later in 2008. This re-release is somewhat similar to the original in gameplay mechanics, but quite different in many ways when it comes to narrative, and features reworked 3D graphics and art, a new control scheme, and even basic motion controls on the Wii. We'll get into this a bit later in the video, but for the purposes of this essay, we'll mainly focus on covering the original 32-bit Saturn and PlayStation versions of Baroque from 1998 and 1999 respectively. Not least of all because the PS1 version is the one that just got a fan translation. Because the original Baroque is something quite peerless indeed. A lost-in-time survival horror magnum opus that is so self-consciously strange, so surrealistic, but also so goddamn engaging and addictive that I can practically guarantee it's unlike just about anything you've ever played. There was simply nothing like it when it first came out, and to this day, few RPGs have executed such a bold and sublime fusion of aesthetics, narrative, and weird-ass brainfuck gameplay as Baroque.
プレイステーションの中に潜む妄想たちが解放される。
If you've been following me for a while, you might have heard me talk about VPN usage in the past. I've basically never been without at least one VPN service in reach since pre-DSL days even, and what's established itself as crucial in a VPN service for me is that it has to be fast and convenient to use, doesn't obstruct your regular internet activity, and verifiably doesn't log anything you do. I've been using NordVPN for about half a year now on my Windows PC, and it's fulfilled all these requirements for me and then some. Nord servers are being regularly independently audited for their no-log policy, while the company operates under the jurisdiction of Panama, a country outside of the Five Eyes, 14 Eyes intelligence sharing alliances, i.e. without mandatory data retention laws, which for you means that no government can legally subpoena them to release your data. The service has kept working smoothly and flawlessly for me and provided great features like customizable kill switch behavior, white and blacklisting individual apps and domains, and it's actually the first VPN app I've used that gives you the deliberate choice not to have any processes run in the background when it's closed, without sneakily clogging up your system without the user's consent, which so many VPN services do, which is not cool, honestly. Anyway, if you want to give NordVPN a shot yourself, you can get a special offer under nordvpn.com/Ragnar, simple and easy, and get a 2-year plus 1 extra month subscription for a really sizable discount, plus a free extra gift for NordVPN's 11th birthday on top. All of it comes with a no questions asked money-back guarantee, so you can evaluate it risk-free. If you're interested, go to nordvpn.com/Ragnar. So, thanks a lot to our sponsor, and now I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Ticking through the different genre descriptors of Baroque reads like a checklist of so many different elements that, on paper, just shouldn't work as well together as it does when they're all brought together. Like, you ready for this? This is a survival horror roguelite, first-person dungeon crawler with procedurally generated levels and gear featuring an intensely surrealistic Shin Megami Tensei meets H.R. Geiger aesthetic, plus a dash of Neon Genesis Evangelion, seasoned to taste. That's a whole mouthful of ludic word salad, and admittedly, quite a lot to take in all at once. But after you get your bearings among the ruins of future Earth and start delving deeper into the game's main dungeon, you'll see how the various design elements and mechanical quirks, the art style, and the carefully drip-fed story were implemented with an enormous degree of care and intentionality, all of which near seamlessly interlocks with and coalesces into an extremely satisfying core gameplay loop across its roughly 12-hour runtime, with barely a dull moment or disappointing break in the action. This is a classic case of the whole being greater than the sum of its many, many, many parts. The entire package is so self-evidently fascinating and compelling, especially for players who have become devotees to the mega-popular Mega 10 series over the last decade and a half. Shin Megami Tensei fans will feel right at home, with more than a few elements from the setting and narrative of Baroque being thematically strongly reminiscent of its signature style and direction. So much so that it almost feels like this game scenario was first written from a spin-off Mega 10 title. But although SMT's publisher Atlus is associated with the game, it's important to point out that the company's role was reduced to exclusively the rollout of the North American release of the 2008 remake, so no involvement in the original whatsoever. So the many thematic overlaps are likely just inspirational spills across the gap. By the late 2020s, humanity had finally answered the oldest and gravest question in existence. A Japanese scientist created an augmented reality program that was able to detect proof of the existence of God, the almighty creator of the known universe. But the god of Baroque is no bearded old dude reigning from atop his Empyrean throne. this demiurge is more like those biblically accurate angels, a mysterious, formless, and crepuscular eldritch biomass hidden deep within the Earth's crust. And after piercing the shrouded realm of the god deep below, madness and devastation was wreaked upon humanity. The entire planet's population was gripped by a sudden onset of mass psychosis, with so-called Baroque murders perpetrated in cities and villages across the world. And then, the strange and ever-shifting nerve tower appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. Its presence triggered the cataclysmic Great Heat Wave, burning and scouring the planet's surface. Nearly the entire human population was wiped out in a flash, with the remaining survivors transformed into twisted, demonic grotesques. Even this short summary already feels like some kind of bonkers alternate reality version of Gnostic Apocrypha like the Gospel of Judas. But the narrative and lore of this one goes even deeper than the précis I've given, and very little of this is delivered through direct exposition to the player. Rather, Baroque employs the classic ludic archaeologist mode of narrative, where the story's layers are gradually peeled back and revealed through the virtuous interplay between cinematics, narrated exposition, conversations with other characters, and especially careful observation and environmental storytelling, item descriptions, and flavor text. Or, if you'd rather ignore it all, this approach also allows players to engage with the story a la carte and focus entirely on the excellent dungeon crawling. And this is where the story begins for our unnamed amnesiac protagonist. Somehow still possessed of your human form and faculties, you arrive at the base of the techno-industrial nightmare nerve tower that looms over Earth's blasted landscape. Haunted by fragmented and disjointed memories from the pre-Armageddon Earth, you must delve deeper and deeper beneath the tower to uncover the mystery of your identity.
Get back the stolen identity!
And why God triggered the apocalypse that destroyed all of his creations. Again, this is a complicated setup for the narrative, underpinned by an even more complicated setup for the gameplay systems. Which is why this is the kind of game where watching someone else play or reading a lore summary wiki barely does it justice. You really have to pick up a controller yourself to grasp just how well each design element works in concert with the others. Because what binds all of it together is Baroque's highly inventive twist on roguelike procedurally generated gameplay. Well, if we want to be accurate, then Baroque absolutely qualifies more as what is now regarded as a roguelite, long before the big resurgence of rogue-type gameplay, where each run is randomized, but certain aspects achieved or unlocked during a run can become a permanent fixture for future runs. But more on that later. While each floor of the Nerve Tower dungeon is randomly and procedurally generated, there are still bespoke rooms, story encounters, and entire sections of certain floors that retain a distinctly recognizable handcrafted touch. This does a great job of guiding the player's experience and ensuring that the main story set pieces and the important plot-centric NPCs all get their time to shine, even though the moment-to-moment gameplay is largely defined by the randomized elements. Baroque also features a demanding resource management gameplay loop that compels instant forward momentum, which is where the survival horror RPG elements kick in. In addition to an on-screen meter and numerical value for your health points, there's also a vitality bar representing the player's stamina that is perpetually ticking down even when you're standing still. And the main way to replenish it is by defeating enemies and gathering the pearl drops of spirit essence they leave behind. As long as you still have vitality points left in the meter to deplete, you'll slowly keep recovering health. But once you run out of vitality, your HP will continue to tick down until you're dead. It's hard to overstate how utterly brilliant the system is in execution, and just how well it systematizes the classic survival horror feeling that the player is in an overwhelmingly hostile and oppressive world through the mechanical foundations of the game, where their limited pool of vital resources is perpetually ticking away. This is basically a very early version of the Bloodborne rally mechanic, or Doom 2016's glory kills, where the player is incentivized into pursuing up-close and personal fights, because it's the primary way to earn the resources you need to stay afloat and progress. And it's exactly what I mean when I say that Baroque's systems were clearly designed with a degree of care and forethought. The developers recognized right away that a player's traditional dungeon crawling mindset could run counter to the game's intended pacing and flow. Because when most RPG players are running low on health or stamina, they naturally slow down and become more cautious and conservative in their approach. Habituated player inaction like that would run totally counter to how Baroque is designed. Restoration points that cure your HP and vitality are few and far in between in the dungeon. And there's no use in retreating to the starting town when your resources are low, because there's no friendly innkeeper who can heal you or merchant selling gear and curatives. Which means the only way out is through. Thus, spurred along by the carrot and stick of Baroque's vitality system, the player is incentivized to act directly against their instincts that have been ingrained via years of conditioning from playing other games. Until your RPG brain is totally rewired and you achieve that classic hardcore Rorschach
Not locked in here with you.
That's it! You're locked in here with me!
flow state. In terms of design lineage, Baroque's structure takes clear inspiration from Japan's Fushigi no Dungeon, or Mystery Dungeon series, and similar roguelikes. Your mission for each run through the mysterious nerve tower is to increase your level by defeating monsters, accumulate an arsenal of randomly generated equipment and items, and make your way to the bottom floor of the dungeon. Or putting it in a way that's more familiar to the slightly more modern player, it's the classic Diablo dungeon loot loop, where each run feels a bit like a pull on a slot machine, executed with supreme confidence and its own distinct sense of style and direction. And if you die before completing a run, you'll lose all of your experience, items, equipment, and progress, and get restarted back to your last save point and the first floor of the dungeon. The twist here is that the conditions to successfully complete a foray through the nerve tower change each time you finish a run. And making it to the bottom of the dungeon, i.e. winning the run, is likewise one of the rare chances the player gets to hard save their progress. There is a suspend save function, but it's only good for a one-time save and load, basically a way to pause and resume the game without losing your progress from shutting down the console. Otherwise, in true rogue fashion, death means losing everything and reverting back to the beginning. This is a damn challenging old-school RPG, and the dungeoneering is every bit as unforgiving as you'd expect. Your first venture into the depths of the nerve tower is basically a straightforward guided tutorial, which is about the most hand-holding you're gonna get from Baroque. The player begins in the outer world in a broken down city, populated by strange-looking but non-hostile grotesques, who utter eerie and seemingly nonsensical phrases when you try to speak with them. As you proceed to the outskirts of the nerve tower that looms on the horizon, a heavenly archangel straight out of Renaissance frescoes materializes. They note your pathetic amnesiac state, hand you an angelic plasma rifle with a 5-shot clip, and demand that you head for the bottom of the nerve tower. That is your mission. When you first pick up the controller, the moment-to-moment gameplay and movement feels just like what you'd expect from a first-person dungeon crawler. You can proceed forward and backpedal, strafe left and right, turn in place, and attack. Combat is fully real-time and consists mostly of slashing away at your foes with your equipped weapon. You will also make use of the occasional randomly generated item that can damage and debuff enemies, or restore your health and stamina, or deplete it, and even trigger the kind of LMAO so random curveball events that make the best roguelikes so memorable, like sparking a room-clearing explosion, teleporting you or the enemy into a completely different part of the level, thieving demons that snatch items, sometimes even mission-critical items, away from you and rush away through the dungeon, or casting an illusion that makes every object and monster in the game look like a lusty succubus. Basically, every time you think you're seeing through the systems and rules of its mechanics, the game goes,
"What rules, you sons of bitches?"
Randomization is a large part of what makes the roguelike experience so fun and addictive, and Baroque is no different. You'll earn equipment, weapons, and items from downed enemies, or even just find gear lying about on the dungeon floor. But as befits Baroque's roguish lineage, most of the items you find are unidentified, meaning you don't know what they'll do when you equip or activate them. An unidentified sword might turn out to be a powerful and game-changing upgrade once you wield it, or it's actually a cursed piece of junk that greatly lowers your chance to hit. And you can't unequip it without using a special cleansing curse removal item. A random shank of flesh could bring you back to full health, or it could poison you. So for some reason, flesh is classified in the intelligence grade of the person whose flesh it was. So does that imply some sort of cannibalism here? Just putting that out there. And a humble vertebra bone could blow your enemies to smithereens, or it might teleport you to the other side of the level, putting you smack dab in the middle of a swarm of hostile grotesques and all but guaranteeing your death. And with the aforementioned health and vitality system spurring the player ever forward, this all comes together into an absolute masterclass in classic game design, one that easily holds its own against the innumerable high-profile roguelikes and proc-gen dungeon crawlers that we've been all but waterboarded with over the last decade plus. So, as you get acquainted with these systems in the first run, you'll descend 5 floors, then
Attack and dethrone God.
and it's job done. You save your game, the world resets itself, your inventory is emptied out. Suddenly, you're back on the surface in the outer world, reverted to a level 1 fledgling and gazing at the nerve tower again as the nearby neck thing once more keens its ululations into the flame-wreathed skies above. And when you find yourself here again, the first-time player will suddenly be struck with a sinking feeling of, what the hell just happened to all my progress? But as you begin your second run, you'll find that the game has changed. The NPCs you meet above and below ground now have refreshed dialogue, providing a new glimpse at the narrative, the backstory, and your current objective. And most noticeably of all, the nerve tower itself has shifted in layout. The dungeon now extends down to 16 floors instead of 5. Tougher enemies patrol the levels, dropping new equipment and items, and even the preset room designs have been altered. This time around, completing your second run is no longer just a simple matter of making it down to the bottom of the nerve tower and blasting away at God with your
Angelic plasma rifle.
Now, progressing through the nerve tower requires the player to solve a near completely unguided and unsignposted environmental puzzle, the solution for which involves talking to different NPCs in the dungeon and paying extremely careful attention to the hints they dispense. And sometimes, the player doesn't even have to fight their way through the bottom of the tower to progress. Dying or committing suicide can actually be a much faster method of completing certain runs, which allows you to skip large chunks of the dungeon crawling for that cycle. But this is never directly stated or otherwise made obvious, and the player must be on their toes to read into the subtle hints and nudges the game is providing in order to figure it out. Again, talk about game design that cuts against player expectations. You just gotta take a moment to appreciate Baroque's brave and forward-thinking design choices here. Players have gone through decades of conditioning that dying in a game and or being reset back to the beginning level equals game over, aka that supreme and most incontrovertible of fail states. And yet Baroque, back before the turn of the millennium, reimagines both the concept and game mechanical implementation of death, not as some kind of ultimate and unforgivable failure, but rather as the player's only avenue for progression, regeneration, and growth. As literally the only way to progress, baked deeply into the mechanical foundation of its narrative. This is pure, infernal, world-turned-upside-down hell logic that so perfectly complements the infernal story and setting. Indeed, this is the main loop and cadence of Baroque. Every time you finish a run, the game's world, mechanics, and narrative all dig a little bit deeper and unveil themselves a bit further, revealing new levels, new monsters, new items and equipment, and new dialogue, characters, and story. A grand, sinister, biblically inspired saga begins to unfold with greater and greater clarity as you become a more accomplished dungeon archaeologist. And this one really goes places, hitting on frankly exactly the kinds of out-of-this-world topics you'd expect from a super experimental 90s-era 32-bit JRPG. It's got fallen angels forsaken by their creator and trapped in a corporeal purgatory, literal body and soul consuming virtual reality run amok, a hyperbolically catastrophic climate change driven apocalypse, and it culminates in the uncovering of the eldritch false god Demiurge who truly rules over the mundane planes of existence. And this is all revealed via the kind of drip-fed, almost episodic approach to storytelling, with each foray through the Nerve Tower feeling like the next airing of a limited-run miniseries. Each new lore detail reveals more of the world's mysteries and presents two new ones in turn, constantly forcing you to retroactively reconsider the narrative rules that you thought were already set in stone. And the game goes like,
What rules, you sons of bitches?
It is all the more impressive for how this expert story pacing complements the game's main mechanics and progression systems. The player is compelled forward by the dangling carrots of better gear and replenished stamina as they hack and slash their way through the dungeon, which reveals more of the story, which in turn challenges you to unlock even more of the game for you to experience, and so on. A near-perfect ludo-narrative synergy, if you will. But man, all of this non-stop gushing, how has it taken me this long to address the 800-pound gorilla in the room? This game got vibes, man. From the moment the opening cinematic sequence begins and the Nine Inch Nails adjacent industrial noise soundtrack kicks in, this game feels like a consummate and totalizing expression of the majestic 1990s goth urban industrial decay aesthetic. And it's not just the killer soundtrack, although the music certainly kicks ass and makes for great listening even outside the context of playing the game. The sound design is incredibly effective too, with its cacophonous soundscapes of industrial noise, demonic utterances carried on distant winds, and strange discordant diegetic melodies with their own mournful and sinister lilt. The use of the heartbeat sound effect deserves a special nod here for how it greatly amplifies the tension and terror of any given moment, with the disembodied sounds of your own heart pounding in tempo with the ebb and flow of combat against the dungeon's grotesques. As I said at the start of this video, Baroque is every bit as much a horror thriller as it is an action RPG. The monster designs too are absolutely striking, featuring some highly detailed and positively absurd sculpted and hand-drawn sprite work. The art style here is so unsettling and alien. Baroque's bestiary really looks like nothing else in gaming, even when compared to its Mega 10 contemporaries, which is the series that's world famous for its incredible monster designs. Baroque's use of high contrast color, bold lighting and shading, and thoughtfully placed baked-in shadows all add an insane amount of mood and mystery to the Nerve Tower. And the sum total of these design choices is the creation of a totally peerless neo-noir aesthetic within the various dungeon environs, where contrast and color is cleverly used to subtly and naturally draw the player's attention to important point of interests. It's a game that feels like a piece of surrealistic fine art that you can be an active part of, with a mind-bogglingly esoteric game narrative that incorporates strong themes of existentialism and absurdism into a far-flung spiritualist view on the cyclical nature of time and existence, and aesthetically heavily inspired by the Rider-Waite tarot deck and tarot iconography in general. Like the player's ultimate weapon, that
Angelic plasma rifle.
you get handed so that you might
Attack and dethrone God.
Well, its ammunition is made of what else? Half-formed fetal angels who were tortured into existence via the eternal suffering of the same imprisoned demiurge god you've been tasked to cleanse. Oh yeah, Baroque is the rare and wonderful example of a game that saw the galaxy-brained madness of Shin Megami Tensei and then said, "You think that's wild? Hold my unsanctimonious beer." If you're a certain type of horror RPG maniac, especially one who enjoys retro games, and especially if you're a fan of Mega 10 or Persona, then Baroque is practically crying out for you to gorge yourself on everything it has to offer. And this recommendation goes for both those who are fans of modern roguelikes and for those who aren't. The big gimmick of many of the most popular roguelikes these days is that they can be played nearly endlessly. Their primary appeal derived from how the player gradually unlocks permanent upgrades that will aid in future playthroughs, further enticing them into the just one more round mode of compulsive play. Like, I'm someone who has a high respect and appreciation for the roguelite genre as a game design principle, and I find myself admiring quite a few outliers of the resurgence of this trend over the past decade or so, but 9 times out of 10, I feel myself thrown off by the moment-to-moment death and reset, and the fact that I have to keep doing everything again and again, even if I got a new weapon or item or a couple new levels or something. It's just more likely to throw me off the bull than to excite me to keep grinding on. I definitely feel like I'm somewhat of an outlier with that, though, I don't know. but Baroque doesn't get me to tilt like that at all. In a way, it's also retro in the sense of how it harkens back to a time when games, especially roguelikes, didn't have to be forever games that would get a bad rating if it didn't provide at least 200 hours of content, but could just have a self-contained narrative and appropriately paced play loop that both work hand in glove to build up to a satisfying conclusion. All within a reasonable time span that is positively mouth-watering for the busy adult whose backlog is longer than God's proverbial beard. As strange and wild as this concept might sound in 2023. So if all of this gushing has caught your attention and you'd like to give Baroque a try, this is the part of the video where I strongly recommend you skip the 2008 PS2 Wii remake for now and instead play the fan translation of the original PS1 version via emulation. In my testing, the patched PS1 version plays perfectly on both the Mednafen and DuckStation emulators, straight up using their default settings as well as via RetroArch. You'll find links in the video description to the emulators and the Baroque translation patch, so you can create your own translated version of the Japanese ROM. Or if you can read Japanese, you could play the Saturn version even, which has long been considered by the Baroque fandom to be the ideal way to play the game, since the PS1 port had to make some controversial changes to the graphics. And hey, in 2020, Nintendo put out a highly regarded original version port of Saturn Baroque for the Switch, though the text is still Japanese only. But let's be real here. If you can read Japanese and you're watching this video, chances are you've already played Saturn Baroque and you're currently in the middle of emailing me several paragraphs of research about the Nerve Tower versus Neuro Tower debate. Love you, Baroque fandom. Never change. Mwah. The remake version on PS2 and Wii, known as Baroque International, is ultimately fine. Like, there's nothing really wrong with it, and if it's the only way you can play this game, then by all means, have at it. But it's still a quite different experience, particularly because of how the much wider field of view, the switch from first-person to third-person perspective, and the inclusion of a lock-on mechanic have kind of neutered much of the original game's atmosphere, tension, and most importantly, challenge. It is a classic case of a remake that takes the original's basic outline and setting and yet homogenizes it in a way on pretty much every front. The new graphics and art style, while still enticing, feel a bit more generic, and the change seems to be an attempt by Sting Entertainment to graft a more unified anime-style aesthetic onto the game to bring it in line with contemporaries like the Persona series, which was just starting its steep trajectory towards mass popularity in the late 2000s. But still, talk about yet another game that has truly been misunderstood in its time, only now is starting to receive its due consideration. I mean, the Metacritic score for this game is 50. Nintendo Power gave the Wii version a motherfucking 3 out of 10. I think the re-release is an inferior experience to the original overall, but Jesus with a plasma rifle, this game is so much better than the contemporary reviewers are giving it credit for.
That's right. This is my state.
It's also crucial to note that about half a year before the ROM hacker Plisken completed their English language version of the Baroque translation, the hacker Mr. Nobody released a Spanish translation of Baroque in late 2021, which provided the bulk of the technical groundwork upon which Plisken's translation was built. So, Spanish-speaking fans actually got to play this one before just about anyone else outside of Japan. Bien hecho, señor Nadia. It also wouldn't be a proper Baroque video essay without a special shout out and salute to the author and administrator to the Nerve Tower fan website, who goes by the nom de plume Lost in Mones. This website is a true labor of love, a wonderful throwback to Web 1.0 web design, and with an astounding collection of official art, interviews, analysis, lore, translation guides, and every other kind of Baroque errata a hyperfixated fan could possibly wish for. And not only that, but the Nerve Tower website was the main source for the research of Plisken's patch, which helped give its unofficial translation the kind of insight and depth that puts even many official works of English localization to shame. This website is absolutely required reading for anyone who plans on playing this game, or even if you just want to demystify the setting and story a little bit. In the game's mythology, Baroque refers to a type of mystical pearl, as in a lustrous crystallization that begins its existence as nothing more than a mote of dirt, a speck of waste, a tiny imperfection. When I think about it like that, it almost feels too good of a coincidence, as the game Baroque is a gem that's none too dissimilar from the pearl drops of vitality the game's fallen enemies leave behind. Because just as a constant cycle of death and renewal is inherent to existence, it likewise takes center stage in Baroque, mechanically, narratively, and thematically. See, I completely understand why this game could never end up becoming a 10 out of 10 million selling era-defining cornerstone of video game history when it was released. It's way too unique, weird, experimental, and daring not to repel all but the most hardcore grognards by design. Baroque will almost certainly never achieve the levels of mega fame that similar Atlas-published dungeon crawlers have earned. And that's completely fine. It's why I personally respect and adore it so damn much, and why it manages to have such a barnacle effect on anyone for whom it does, in fact, click. It's one of those pieces of art you just won't be able to stop thinking about, like a brain parasite that keeps festering and growing to unexpected proportions in your mind once it's nested in. But as the shape-shifting and ephemeral nature of Baroque's setting reminds the player, the mundane and corporeal world of this existence will never provide us with a singular, fixed, wholly higher truth. Reality is fluid and constantly changing, with a massive degree of subjectivity inherent to any attempt at interpretation. The flaws of an unforgiving difficulty level, or the impurities of a strange and impenetrable horror art design, or the imperfections of a confusing narrative that self-consciously frustrates the desire to achieve a singular definitive interpretation, all of these things must first exist, or the pearl, the Baroque, will never take shape around them. And much like the imperfections that define human existence, it's the supposed flaws of Baroque that have made it stand the test of time as one of my all-time favorite dungeon crawlers, and one of the finest cult classic RPGs to grace the 32-bit era.
常に変化する。助けて。声が聞こえる。展開が歪む。衝撃的な真実が。
Now, as someone who wishes that Baroque had had much more than just its rippled, avant-garde impact on video game history through a tiny subset of die-hard cult fans, I'm always happy to see video games that wear the inspiration on their sleeve, especially when indie devs pick up the torch and openly take inspiration from Baroque. Best opportunity for me to showcase another indie game during my credit sequences, which today is They Speak from the Abyss, a grotesque and surreal, hand-drawn first-person dungeon crawler that cites Baroque, Shin Megami Tensei, and Nimuramayu as its main inspiration. The game is currently in development, and you can play an extended demo on the developer's itch.io page, and as always, if this looks intriguing to you, you should hop over to the Steam page and wishlist it. It helps indie devs a great deal. The links are in the description. If this has been your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on this channel I largely cover old games, horror games, indie games, and combinations thereof. So if you want to help me out with my work on the channel and everyone who participates in making these videos, the main source of income for the channel is, and has been for a long time, crowdfunding. And if you want to, you can pitch in over on my Patreon. Even a small monthly donation really goes a long way, so thank you a lot already for considering. Big thanks to my active patrons, and as with each video, a special thank you this time goes out to Terry Collins, Thwagam, Dana Rosa, Chrissy, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Thomas Bona, Ronan Crom aka Daniel 242172, Chuck Taylor, Risha Griggs, Laird Wackala, Disco Dwarf, Tlebin, Uziel 1447, Dylan Labonte, Shannon Blue, Refkins and Triscuits, Teraflops, Kyle Lee, Giselle, Isabella Stoner, Jin Hansen, Cannon Ward, Maria Rios, Lillian B., Boris Bugling, John Boring, Swiss Hackmod, Casper Rom, Max Kasari, Vincent Kavanaugh, David Zelenak, Neil Snowden, Felix D., Tabby, Kerry George, Franz Johannes Feulner, The Spiral Architect, Gehennas, Corey Marr, Matt Gretton, Vasily Prokhorov, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Lawrence E. Buben, Alex Popov, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Nathan Gillick, Storina Abramson, Samantha, Amber Wiggins, Catherine Escobar, Nikot the Brave, Morrigan K., Billy Lott, Nineball9606, Thomas Patrick Hooper, Hippo Hobbly, Aurora Melpomene Crescendo, Federico Rocha, Daniela Alvarez, Sable Cowell, Felix, Link Hughes, Lois Lane, Beruga Dono, Agustino Ortega, and Ian Rhodes. Until next time, ta-ta.